Well, to break down more of the Oxfam report, I'm joined by Paul O'Brien. He's Vice President for Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam America. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Rachelle.
Now, let's start out with something that really stood out from that report, this idea that 8 people have as much wealth as 3.6 billion people. Is this a question of just these 8 people getting wealthier and the rest are just earning a lot less? What's happening here?
Both are happening. So the richest are getting even richer and the poor are being left behind. Over the last 25 years, the top 1% has gained more in income than the bottom 50%. The trend is just getting worse.
And as we look at this trend, which are the countries or parts of the world where that difference is really the most stark?
Amongst the major global economies, Russia is perhaps the worst, where 1% owns about 70% of the economy. But neither China nor the United States does very well. They're both in the top 10 most unequal by this measure. China, top 1%, has about the same wealth as 44% of the economy. In the US, it's only slightly less at 42%. So it's bad in these large economies. And that's where much of the action has to happen if we're going to get it under control.
Now, as Jack mentioned, we hear a lot about these staggering statistics, but when it comes to actually seeing a difference on the ground, why do you think we're not seeing that?
It's a number of things. You've got to have individual states where this is happening, like the United States, like China, but many developing countries tackle it in their own environments to make sure that they collect more money, which should properly be spent on public services. But it's also now a global problem because you have corporations that are acting globally and engaging in legal forms of tax avoidance, but that is essentially robbing economies of the money they need for healthcare, education, and employment creation.
So as we look globally, is the situation better or worse when it comes to urban areas versus rural areas?
We didn't look at specific data for urban and rural areas in this report, but anybody looking at what's going on now, take, for example, the United States and the elections that happen here. If you look at where much of the change in the electorate happened, it wasn't just in certain states, it was in rural communities as opposed to urban areas. It's very clear economically that many populations in rural areas in the United States and around the world are being left behind by this global economy, and they're increasingly frustrated, which is why you see much of this big political change that's going on.
Now, what about China? We know that there's always been this big push to really pull people out of poverty. How do you think that's going to shape the income inequality discussion?
China has much to be proud of. We wouldn't have achieved the Millennium Development Goals if it hadn't been for the people lifted out of poverty in China, but we're far away from getting where we need to, even in the Chinese context. They may have tripled wage rates in the last 20 years, but at the same time, you've seen a real growth in extreme inequality. There are more billionaires in China now than anywhere else on the planet Earth, more than in the United States, 593 in China. And if you look at where the poorest 50% of humanity are, 15% of them are still in China.
Now, Paul, help us get an understanding. When you have so much wealth concentrated, as you're saying, in this 1%, what are some of the consequences?
What you have in the end of the day is a global system. It's not the fault of these 8 billionaires on their own. In fact, many of them are philanthropists that they have so much money. But that is a symptom of a global economy that can't regulate itself effectively anymore, which is why in Davos they need to talk about that. When a global economy is under-regulated and you have this massive wealth expansion at the top end, you don't get education, healthcare, job creation, and the opportunity for people to lift themselves from poverty on the other end, which is why an organization like Oxfam is so concerned.
And obviously, we can't wave a magic wand and solve all these issues, but if there were some measures that you think would at least go towards narrowing the gap, what would some of that be?
Well, first, you've got to get more money out of where it is being wasted or just sitting idly in tax havens and doing nothing and spent on building inclusive economies. So you've got to increase domestic resource mobilization in a lot of developing countries. You've got to make tax systems more progressive. You've got to deal with wage problems. You can't have particularly women being left behind by economic growth. They should not be getting unequal pay for the same work. They should not be uncompensated for the care economy. But then you also have to have progressive expenditure policies that invest in giving people the tools to lift themselves from poverty, getting them the information to deal with this modern age, healthcare, broader education, those kinds of expenditure policies, which is why we need something very positive to come out of Davos.
Indeed. Well, here's hoping that may be the case. Thank you so much, Paul O'Brien from Oxfam America, Vice President for Policy and Campaigns.
Thank you for having me, Rachelle.